This tree behind me is what a lot of people call the Christmas tree. Now, the Christmas tree is not really a species of tree, but a lot of species of pine, spruce, fir, and so on are used as Christmas trees across the world. But do you know how this tradition of decorating trees for Christmas really began? Find out more in this episode of Tree Talk. One of the central features of the celebration of Christmas is decorating trees like this, exchanging gifts, sitting under a tree, and hanging lights and various other knickknacks on the tree. While all this leaves us with a very warm, fuzzy feeling, the truth behind how this tradition really began is anything but warm.
Today, Europe is largely Christian. But before Emperor Constantine took to the faith, thereby beginning a new episode in the history of Christianity, the people of the continent followed more nature-based faiths. For instance, the Celtics. They worshipped trees, stones, and various other forms of nature. Trees in particular were a central part of their faith system, as they believed that all trees, and most of all the oak tree, were imbued with tree spirits. Hence they respected and worshipped trees. As a side note, in India, the concept has existed for centuries. Tree spirits are called Yaksha or Yakshi in the male and female form respectively, but more on that in another episode. Getting back to Europe, tree worship was not acceptable to the early proponents of Christianity. This idea of attributing a soul or spirit to all life forms, including plants and trees, known as animism, is an idea that early Christians frowned upon. Its followers were labelled as pagans and their faith was called paganism, both terms used in a derogatory sense, that is, disrespectfully. And slowly, representatives of the church went all out to stamp out such practices as worshipping trees. This is borne out by several accounts, some of which I'll mention here, drawn from this book, The Conversion of Europe by historian Richard Fletcher, that speaks about how Europe was Christianized starting from the 3rd century onwards. Sample this edict of a bishop from sometime in the 6th century from a place in modern-day France. We have heard that some of you make vows to trees, pray to fountains, and practice diabolical augury. Because of this, there is such sorrow in our hearts that we cannot receive any consolation. What are these unfortunate, miserable people doing? They are deserting the light and running to darkness. They reject God and embrace the devil. They desert life while they follow after death. By repudiating Christ, they proceed to impiety. Here's another from around the same era. For to burn candles at stones and trees and springs and where 3 roads meet, what is it but the worship of the devil? Slowly they stepped up the pressure. Simple reprimanding turned to outright mockery and derision, and that soon turned to stern law, making non-Christian practices like these punishable with death. Now, winter can be a very harsh time in many parts of the world. The days are short, it is dark and damp, there's not much sunlight, and the trees, most of them, shed their leaves and look lifeless and bare. But in that dreary environment, imagine if you saw something holding out strongly, still green and very much alive, amidst all the other trees that look limp and pale. Isn't it a sign of hope and reassurance? Well, that is exactly how several ancient cultures saw these evergreen trees that stood out in stark contrast to deciduous trees in the winter months. It gave them resilience and reassured them that life would go on. Solstice in this context was an important event for people back in those times because it marked a turning point in the calendar where the length of the day and night would change in the months to come. The winter solstice that occurs on 21st December in the northern hemisphere as per the Gregorian calendar we use today is when we have the shortest day and the longest night, and that was an important marker for ancient cultures from the Egyptians to the Romans because it meant that from that moment on daylight hours would increase. It was hence marked in various forms, and in a large number of cases that was done by using evergreen plants to symbolize the event. For instance, the ancient Egyptians worshipped the sun amongst other gods, whom they called Ra. They believed that the onset of winter was due to Ra, the sun god, becoming ill, forcing him to make shorter appearances every day. The winter solstice was hence the day when Ra was said to begin recovering from his illness, and hence a day of celebration. The Egyptians celebrated this with evergreen palm leaves that became symbolic of good health and life, overcoming illness and death. The ancient Romans also had a similar celebration to mark winter solstice with evergreen trees, as did the ancient Celtics and several others. Now, a question may have popped up in your mind. Why are some trees evergreen? Why do they not lose their leaves in winter like the others? Well, that's an interesting question, but I'm going to have to keep that for another episode. Sign up to the channel if you'd like to stay posted. So, getting on with our story. In pre-Christian Europe, tribes like the Celtics, who believed that trees were imbued with spirits, thought that by bringing the leaves of some evergreens into the house during the winter months, they would be protected from the cold by those guardian spirits protecting the trees. The Druids, who were said to be the learned class among the Celtic people, decorated their temples with leaves of evergreen trees. To them, the oak was the most revered of all trees. The oaks were massive, towering giants with their arms reaching up into the skies. They were symbols of wisdom. People met under these trees. Village elders held council under these trees. Hence, the tree slowly came to symbolize wisdom and justice. The holly tree was another respected tree for the Celtics. In fact, the Celtics divided the year into two halves, the light half and the dark half. While oak was the king of the light half, holly, his brother, was the lord of the dark half. It was believed that the oak king and the holly king battled during the solstices. The holly king would win at the summer solstice and begin his reign, while the oak would win at the winter solstice to start his. Hence, while the oak was the controller of the light half of the year, the holly tree controlled the dark winter months. As the holly was evergreen, the ancient Druids and Romans decorated their temples and doors with holly leaves. As Christianity took root in Europe, every such practice and belief was called into question. The worship of trees was derided, and those worshipping trees were persecuted for following the devil. An infamous incident that is believed to have turned the tide was this one. Saint Boniface, an English monk and missionary who converted large parts of Europe to Christianity and was later elevated to the role of archbishop in the 8th century, was once passing through the area of Hesse in Germany. It was during the winter solstice, and he is said to have encountered a group of people around an old oak tree worshipping what they called Thor's oak. Horrified, he is said to have grabbed an axe and hacked down the tree. Now, with everything that's so ancient, multiple versions crop up. And one version is that immediately after he'd hacked down the oak tree, a fir tree grew in its place. Some versions say he planted a fir tree in place of the oak. Still others have it that the wood of the oak that he cut down transformed magically into a cross. Any which way, the story goes that as soon as he'd cut down the tree, he called upon the people, whom he called pagans, to see the power of his god over theirs. Upon seeing this, the people are said to have converted almost immediately, and from then on, for people who were given to believing that trees were sacred, the fir tree was seen as a representative of what began to be called the true faith. It is said that by the following year, all the people in the area had converted to Christianity, and on the day of the winter solstice, they began hanging decorations on the fir tree to celebrate the day. This is a famous painting that captures the dramatic moment when Saint Boniface hacked down a giant oak. And what did Boniface do to the oak that he felled? Well, he used the wood to build a church. Check out Donar's Oak online to read more about it. This event became popular, and slowly people who'd been nature worshippers began doubting their faith and turning to Christianity. The old symbols like the oak tree came into disrepute as the evergreen fir tree rose in stature. The practice of adding lights on the tree is attributed to Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer from the 16th century. Even so, the practice was muted and not quite as spectacular as it is these days. Record suggests that early white settlers in America frowned upon this ritual as it was considered by them a mockery of the spirit of Christmas. In fact, would you believe it? In 1659, a court in Massachusetts enacted a law under which any observance other than a church service was made a penal offense, and people were actually fined for hanging decorations. But slowly, as more Germans and other immigrants came into the country in the 19th century, the puritanical approach went through a change. And the tipping point, it appears, was when Queen Victoria, whose husband Prince Albert had German roots, decorated a tree along with her family. After this, the practice of decorating trees for Christmas became a popular tradition, slowly growing into the grand and enormous Christmas trees we see today. A study of religious history shows us how faith cements itself in any new land. Whether done through force or through persuasion, appropriation of the religious symbols of the older faith is a common pattern. This case is particularly interesting to me as it is at the cusp of my three fields of interest: history, mythology, and trees. Because in this case, the appropriated symbols were trees. The holly tree is a case in point. As mentioned before, the holly was one of the revered trees of the Celtics. In Christian thought, it became a part of the crown of thorns placed upon Jesus during his crucifixion. It was also said that the holly berries used to be white in earlier times, but that they turned red after being touched by the blood of Christ, and that they were called holly because it was holy. So while the oak was hacked down as a pagan symbol to be eventually replaced by coniferous trees like pine and fir, the holly tree was appropriated into Christian beliefs. In fact, some scholars suggest that 25th December, the day of Christmas itself, as the birth date of Jesus Christ, was appropriated by early Christians from earlier faiths, which was said to have been the day of an ancient Roman festival called Saturnalia, which was based on the winter solstice. Saturnalia is also said to be the source of several Christmas traditions like wreaths, candles, feasting, and gift-giving. As Fletcher puts it in his book, the Christianization of space was matched by a Christianization of time.
Now, I didn't mean to dampen your Christmas spirit, but hey, that's the truth about Christmas trees. But isn't it ironical that trees, the very thing that early Christians went after in medieval Europe to Christianize the continent, have made a comeback as the central focal point of the most Christian of all festivals? On a different note, this tree behind me is called the New Caledonian pine, also called the Cook's pine, because the English happened to discover it during the voyage of Captain Cook. Now, this tree behaves differently in different parts of the world, which has startled quite a number of botanists. I'm going to be discussing that in another episode. In the meantime, if this episode of Tree Talk has helped you learn more about the trees around you, I urge you to check out some of the other videos. And while I'm not exactly expecting gifts to be left for me under trees, I do hope you can share this video with friends and subscribe to stay posted to more of the videos. Merry Christmas to all of you.